Okay, we are now ready for demonstration number 2, for sample number 2 for the FACS exploration sewing samples. Sample 1, we serged each of the edges of our square. Now we are going to use that same square to work on practicing our seam allowances and our pivoting. On your machine, you're going to turn your machine on. The power button is right on the right hand side towards the back. And we want to very first step says we want to put our needle down. The default setting is needle up. If we push this button right here, it changes our setting to needle down. We want our needle down because we are pivoting in this sample. The very first seam allowance that we want to try is a 5/8 inch seam allowance. This is where we are going to be looking right here on our stitch plate. 5/8 of an inch is actually engraved in the stitch plate, 5/8 right there. So what we want to do is we want to line up our fabric so that it is going halfway back in the presser foot and that the edge of our fabric is lined up right on that 5/8 of an inch mark. We are going to sew 1 or 2 stitches and then we are going to back stitch. Our back stitch button is right here, 1 or 2 stitches. You want to get in the habit of back stitching. Remember, the machine is going to do the work. All your hands have to do is guide the fabric, keeping it lined up on that 5/8 of an inch mark. As you approach the other side, you'll notice that when I stop sewing, the needle stays down through the fabric. That's so that we can pivot. We lift up the presser foot and we can move and rotate our fabric any which direction we want. We want to rotate it a 90-degree angle, and then we want to see, am I lined up on my 5/8 of an inch? No, I'm not. So I want to rotate back and I want to go just a couple more stitches to the point where I think I am 5/8 of an inch from this edge. I lift up my presser foot and I pivot. Now my fabric is exactly on that 5/8 of an inch line. So now I can rotate or sew down the second side, keeping my fabric lined up on that 5/8 of an inch mark. My only thing my hands are doing is keeping the fabric sewing straight. I could go 1 more stitch. Ooh, that was probably too many. Oh, I'm okay. We're keeping it lined up on that 5/8 of an inch line all the way across. The straighter you sew, the easier this is to tell. Needle is down, pivot, I'm on my 5/8 of an inch mark, and I work my way across to where I started. When I get to my starting point, I'm going to back stitch just 2 or 3 stitches. I'm going to put needle up. I'm going to release my fabric from the machine and trim the threads. The distance from the seam, we'll do this way, the seam to the edge of the fabric is 5/8 of an inch on all 4 sides. The third step says we are going to repeat this process using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is the outside edge of the presser foot right here. I'm going to start in the same place, put my fabric halfway back on my presser foot. My fabric is lined up on the outside edge of my presser foot, which is a 1/4 of an inch, which is the same thing as saying 2/8. I'm going to put my needle down. I'm going to sew 1 or 2 stitches. I'm going to back stitch 1 or 2, and I'm going to use my hands to guide my fabric to keep it on the outside edge of the presser foot. This stitch will be stitching right on the edge of your serging, so it's really kind of easy to follow. I'm going to pivot when I get to the corner. You can kind of just barely see the stitch outside of your serging. Super easy one to do, and one that we will be utilizing a lot as we go through our various projects. As I approach the other side, if I go too far on accident, okay, and I go to pivot and I'm not on the outside edge of my presser foot, pivot back stitch just a couple of stitches and work your way across. Now I'm lined up on the outside edge of my presser foot and I can work my way across. As I approach the other side, slow down just a little bit, needle is down, pivot at the corner, and we are approaching our starting spot. Once we reach to that point, we are going to back stitch just 2 or 3 stitches, needle up, and trim our threads. I am now ready to do the final step, which is to do an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. The 1/8 of an inch seam allowance is lining up your fabric on the inside edge of the presser foot, which is just on the inside there. So a 1/4 of an inch is out here, 1/8 of an inch is in here. We're setting our fabric halfway back on the foot pedal and lining our fabric up on the inside edge of that foot pedal. We're going to push needle down, so 1 or 2 stitches, back stitch 1 or 2, and work our way around, pivoting at each of the corners. You're going to be sewing right through the middle of the serging. It's going to be really, really hard for your eyes to see.
Logan calmly, your right is up front. Logan calmly.
You're going to work your way around the sample. Your eyes might not be able to see it, but Mrs. Peterson and my eyes will be able to see that you have sewn this 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you get to your starting spot, backstitch just 2 or 3 stitches, needle up, and trim your threads. Sample 2 is complete.